The speaker, our first speaker this afternoon is David Lallemant, who is an assistant professor at NTU and co-founder of Stanford Urban Resilience Initiative, which you see on there. And of course, in introducing David, just to say that he was telling me he is French origin. He spent a lot of time in Thailand and then eventually moved to the USA. And of course, he was educated at MIT, UC Berkeley, and finally Stanford, and all these eminent institutions. And now, finally, he has reached the apogee by coming to NTU. So we're very, very happy to have him here, and not only at NTU, but to talk to us today. And of course, we've already heard a lot about urbanization and the both opportunities on one side, but very much the threats of urbanization and intensification of urbanization on the other. So really, without more ado, David, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is David Lallemant, as you can see. And in the past couple of years, I've been based at Stanford, first doing my PhD, and then as a research scientist and co-founder of the Stanford Urban Resilience Initiative, which I realized just now I managed to include a typo in my title slide. So excuse me for that. Hopefully, that's the only one. Anyway, it's really humbling to be invited to be a speaker today at this conference. I've heard some absolutely phenomenal presentations in the past day and a half, and the other speakers have really set a very high bar for me. So I really wanted to thank Jan, thank NTU, distinguished guests, and my fellow speakers for giving me an hour and a half of your time so I can share with you a topic that I'm very impassioned about, and that's the topic of the risk and resilience of our cities. So some of you might recognize this. This is the San Francisco skyline. If you haven't been to San Francisco, I encourage you to visit. It's a beautiful city. It's exposed to a lot of earthquakes, which is not the reason you should go, but that was the reason that I've spent many years there. I'm moving to Singapore, which I'm very excited about, so I had to update my slides. Luckily for me, Singapore has also a very beautiful skyline. A lot of my slides are hand-drawn, and you'll have to be gracious with me. I'm not an artist, and I'm also colorblind. So if some of the colors are jarring to you, I apologize. And if the ocean is colored purple, it's not necessarily contaminated by chemicals. It's an honest mistake. So I thought I'd start actually giving you a bit of background about myself and how I came to be interested in this topic of urban resilience. And in part, I'm not a distinguished speaker, so you might not know very much about me. So this is my opportunity to tell you more. So I grew up in a city not too far from here in northern Thailand, a city called Chiang Mai. Another city that you should absolutely visit if you get the opportunity, if you haven't visited already, a very, very beautiful city. And this was my house in 2005. And that's my mom and my sister. And, these type of floods were relatively common. Every 5 years, we would have to lift up our furniture and live on the top floor for a few days. And at the time when I was very young, my little sister and I would have a lot of fun. The kitchen was in a separate building, so we had a paddle boat that we would use to go from the house to the kitchen, which was a lot of fun. Disasters can be fun. They rarely are, but as a child, at least that was an aspect that we enjoyed. This is one of the main temples in Chiang Mai, Wat Chedi Luang. Absolutely beautiful temple. This is actually the Chedi behind the temple complex. And it's also the last remaining relic of the 1545 earthquake that affected the area. And I'm very concerned for the city of Chiang Mai because when this earthquake happened, there was only a couple thousand people there, and the entire urban development since then has occurred without any consideration for the real seismic risk. So after I finished high school in Thailand, and afterwards, as was mentioned, I went to MIT to do my bachelor's degree in engineering, and during my sophomore year, my family and I went to the southern coast of India for Christmas holidays. And as we were landing, I remember seeing from my window a huge flood, which was very surprising. We had not heard of a flood. It hadn't been raining particularly, and it's only hours later that we started to understand that, in fact, there had been a huge tsunami, a word which no one really knew at the time. It's really after that event that the word tsunami became kind of globally known. And luckily the airport was a few kilometers inland, so it didn't get affected directly, but we witnessed the impact that this massive disaster had on the communities on the Indian coast. And it was quite traumatizing. And when I went back to MIT, I decided to focus my studies on disasters. And while I had started working on computer science, I changed to civil engineering and so afterwards I went to Berkeley. And as I was finishing my degree, there was another very large earthquake in Haiti in January 2010. And I got a random call from the World Bank. They were looking for a French-speaking engineer who knew something about earthquakes and who was willing to be in Haiti in 24 hours. I qualified for all those things. So I went there for what was supposed to be kind of a 2-week mission to help the government assess the damages to some of the critical infrastructure. That 2-week mission turned into 2 years of me living in Haiti, working with the Haitian government, working with the World Bank on various post-disaster reconstruction and recovery activities. And that really shifted my interest in this field, and my academic interest in particular. Before, I'd really focused on structural design and on trying to design better buildings, better performing buildings. But my experience in Port-au-Prince really pushed my interest towards trying to understand risk at an urban or regional scale. Trying to really understand what were the mechanisms through which extreme vulnerability got created in the city of Port-au-Prince. So I decided to go back to university to pursue a PhD on this topic of urban risk at Stanford this time. And while I was at Stanford, I did not stop being involved in post-disaster recovery and reconstruction. After most kind of big events, I was involved, and in particular, after the earthquake in Christchurch, not immediately after, actually a couple years after, I went to Christchurch and worked with the Red Cross to write a book on leadership in disaster recovery. I'm no expert on leadership and disaster recovery, but me and my colleagues interviewed about 100 leaders who had worked in disaster recovery contexts, and we were trying to extract their wise words from their experience. And it was, for me, a really important actually experience to do that work. And the results were very interesting, and so we published this book for the Red Cross. And then more recently, I spent quite a few months in Nepal following the earthquake, once again working with the World Bank to help the government of Nepal put together their post-disaster recovery program. And when I wasn't in these disaster settings, I was living in the Bay Area. Specifically, Stanford University is right there. That's the San Andreas Fault, and it's about 5 kilometers away. Luckily, while I was there was no earthquake, and hopefully I'm still there for a few months. It won't happen while I'm there. But earthquake risk is something we live with and we think about every day at Stanford, and actually I hope that more people thought about it every day, but I certainly do. So that's kind of a bit about me and how I got to be interested in this topic. And I wanted to kind of open my talk as well with something that Shakespeare said. or wrote, rather. And it's a quote from Shakespeare, which resonates with me. I think a lot of what we talk about in disaster risk management field is this idea that disasters are not natural. We talk about this term of natural disasters, but the hazard is natural. The disaster is not. It's man-made. So I rarely get the opportunity to recite Shakespeare, so please allow me to do so. So the Earl of Gloucester has just had a fight with his son in King Lear and says, "These late eclipses of the sun and moon portend no good to us. Though the wisdom of nature can reason it thus and thus, yet nature finds itself scourged by the sequent effects. Love cools, friendships falls off, brothers divide. In cities mutinies, in countries discord, in palaces treason, and the bond cracked twixt son and father." And so then, after that, the Earl of Gloucester leaves, and his son, who has been hiding and hears this, comes in and says, "This is the excellent foppery of the world, that when we are sick in fortune, often the surfeit of our own behavior, we make guilty of our disasters the sun, the moon, and the stars, as if we were villains on necessity, fools by heavenly compulsion, knaves, thieves, and treacherers by spherical predominance, drunkards, liars, and adulterers by an enforced obedience of planetary influence, and all that we are evil in by divine thrusting on, an admirable evasion of whoremaster man, to lay his goatish disposition on the charge of a star." And so this passage resonates with me because Shakespeare is saying that our disasters are not caused by the sun and the moon, and I will extend that to earthquakes and hurricanes and floods. Our disasters are caused by us. We decide where we build, we decide what we build our urban systems, and so forth. And that is the drivers of risk. So we need to avoid being goatish, is my point. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to be using these terms: risk, hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. And oftentimes, these are used interchangeably, but I'll be using them in quite specific ways. So I wanted to very quickly explain how I'll be using them. So risk is the combination of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, where hazard is the descriptor of the geophysical drivers, so earthquakes, floods, and so forth, which are typically described in terms of probability of exceeding a certain intensity of shaking or intensity of wind, and so forth. The exposure represents the people, the buildings, and everything else that's affected by those hazards. And that's important and explains why, for instance, if an earthquake happens in the middle of the desert, a disaster doesn't happen because there's no one there. So there's no exposure to that hazard. And finally, vulnerability describes the propensity of those assets or people to be negatively impacted by those hazards. And that's typically described in terms of probability of suffering a certain level of loss or damage given a certain intensity of hazard. And you need those three to create risk, right? And that's kind of the premise for the rest of my talk on urban risk and resilience. So I'm going to start out, like everyone else, with some pretty pessimistic statements. And that is that our global risk is increasing, and it's increasing very, very rapidly. And that's because each of the pieces that make up our risk are individually increasing. So let's look at hazard, right? So as other people have presented before, climate change will be increasing the intensity and severity of floods and hurricanes and storms. Sea level rise will mean, a big problem for a lot of our coastal communities. We can expect more and intense droughts and heat waves. And finally, if that wasn't enough, many of our cities are subsiding due to kind of water pumping and other mechanisms. So we're compounding a lot of these problems. Our exposure is increasing. I had a really interesting conversation this morning about population growth and perhaps the need to control that population growth, and that was mentioned as well in the previous presentation. And on the surface of things, if we have more people on the planet, that would mean more exposure to risk. So obviously our exposure is increasing. The problem is compounded because the vast majority of population growth is being absorbed by our cities. And our cities are statistically more exposed to hazards. Our cities tend to be coastal or on riverbeds, so obviously exposed to flooding and storms and tsunamis and so forth. But even earthquakes, where it's maybe less intuitive why statistically our cities would be more exposed to earthquakes, but fault lines run down like valleys, which are kind of a natural place to place a city rather than on a steep slope. The city that I've lived in San Francisco, we have an amazing view of the bay on one side. It's a peninsula, and then the ocean on the other side. That peninsula was created through a series of earthquakes over millions of years. And then, we could say the same thing about volcanoes. Setting up near a volcano, it has been common in history because of the fertile soils around volcanoes and so forth. And the rate at which urbanization is occurring is really mind-boggling. So to put things into perspective, there are more people living in cities today than there were total people on the planet in 1970. 1970 is really not very long ago. It's when the Jungle Book came out, the Disney version of the Jungle Book. That's not very long ago. That's within one generation. And that process is still continuing. Things get worse. I was talking about trends at kind of the global scale and global migratory scale. But if you look within cities at patterns of urbanization, as cities get constrained in space, it creates additional pressure for people to occupy more and more hazardous land. And we see this across cities around the world. In Chiang Mai, we see it with people building over canals. In other cities, we see people building on reclaimed land, or, well, quite literally in the case of Port-au-Prince, for instance, just dumping trash in the ocean and then kind of packing it down and then building a house on it, or on steep slopes. And then finally, I think we presume that we're getting smarter in how we build and the infrastructure that we're designing and the buildings that we're designing. But as Peter Ho mentioned yesterday, the systems that underpin the functioning of our cities are increasingly complex, increasingly interconnected, and increasingly optimized. And this push towards more optimized, complex, interdependent systems is in many ways making them more vulnerable. And on top of that, we have all these human networks that interact with our urban systems in processes that we don't currently fully understand. And then one of the drivers of risk, of increasing vulnerability that I'm very interested in, and I'll talk about this more later, is the process of incremental building construction. So that's when you start with a one-story building, and then after a few years, you add another floor and expand it over the sidewalk, and you keep going. And that's really the de facto way that cities get built in a lot of the world. All right. So at this point, I've just said that risk is increasing. Risk is increasing very rapidly. It's increasing more rapidly even than population. So we have many reasons to think that the glass is half empty. So in the common question, is the glass half full, half empty, which is supposed to show if you're a pessimist or an optimist. I think we have many reasons to believe that it's half empty, and I am very aware that my presentation is coming after we've already talked about the fact that we're all going to die from a pandemic, from other disasters, from climate change, from a new president-elect. There are many kind of ways that reasons why we should be pessimistic. But I'm going to try for the remaining part of the talk to bring some optimism and focus on the things that I've been working on or thinking about for us to kind of address this issue. Part of my optimism, actually, is that this incredible process of urbanization is not over. And so one of my professors from MIT told me that in order to meet the demands of urbanization in the past 3-4 decades, we will have to rebuild the equivalent of everything we've ever built in the past 6,000 years. That is a tremendous amount of infrastructure, and it's very scary. But at the same time, it also means that if we do it right, we can lock ourselves into a more resilient future. So I think we have this amazing opportunity now and for the next few decades. So the title of this conference was Disrupted Balance, Society at Risk. I've kind of modified it a little bit to Society at Increasing Risk. So what do we do? And I'm just going to borrow a concept and graphic from ecology and the ecological conception of resilience. And I apologize if there are any ecologists in the room and if I kind of misrepresent what this is saying, but I'll explain at least how I understand it and how it's been useful in my thinking. And it's basically that we currently lie in a stable state. Pressures, there are pressures to push us out of this state. And that hill that needs to be surmounted is our resilience and keeps us in our current state, essentially. It prevents us from going into another state. And I think a lot of the concerns around climate change is specifically that beyond a certain point, even if we stop what we're doing, if we pass this tipping point, the top of this hill, we won't be able to go back. And we will end up falling into a completely different state, right? And we don't know what that state is, and there's a lot of uncertainty and fear about that, right? So I'm going to be talking about some of the ways I think we can build our resilience. So I'm not saying we're currently in the right state either, but at least to not make things worse. So the first is about understanding and modeling how our risks are changing. I use the term riskscapes to present this idea of a landscape of risk because I think we live in a multi-hazard world, and I think that's I like words, so I just decided to create a new one. In order to answer this question, and this was kind of the bulk of my PhD, was kind of developing dynamic risk models. And that kind of forced me to look at a ton of fascinating topics, looking at how we model hazards, working with Google on that, working on the use of remote sensing to better understand our exposure, and developing statistical models for vulnerability. Really interesting things. And I'll focus on how, and all this kind of fits in. That's what this graphic is supposed to show, that it all fits together. And the main purpose was to develop these kind of dynamic risk models. So my question was, how are the dynamic processes of urbanization changing the risk profile of our cities? And I was focusing on two of these processes: how exposure is changing and how vulnerability is changing. And I used earthquake risk as the main case study. Obviously, kind of being based in California, that makes sense, but I think one of the main reasons is that when you talk about changing risk, people automatically think about climate change and changing hazard as the driver for changing risk. I wanted to say that even if the hazard is not changing, our risks are changing because our cities are changing, our exposure is changing, our vulnerability is changing. And those are things that we have complete control over. So I also wanted to look at tools that we could develop to support resilient and sustainable cities. So by changing exposure, I wanted to understand how, as cities evolve, each new person into the city is statistically more likely to be in a more dangerous location than the person that came before. Statistically, obviously, that's not true in any absolute sense. And then one of the main drivers of vulnerability that I was interested to model and understand was this process of building, incremental building expansion. And I wanted to reemphasize this, that it really is, this ad hoc process of incremental construction is the default way that cities around the world are being built. And that's true in Bangladesh, in India, in Turkey, in Greece. all over Latin America. It is really, really a common way that cities get built. And from my colleagues in the urban planning field, they see this as a good thing, and in many ways it is. It is one of the only ways that we've found to meet the tremendous need for housing people moving into cities. And no one is looking at what that means for risk, and in particular, in this case, earthquake risk. And this was really driven home to me in 2013, following the collapse of the Ranza factory, garment factory. Kerry C. yesterday mentioned that Bangladesh is the country where buildings collapse spontaneously, and I think he was referring to this case, right? Just to remind you, this factory collapsed spontaneously, killing 1,300 people. It was an absolutely horrible, horrible event. And a lot of the attention following that event was on the garment industry and kind of putting pressure on the garment industry to change their practices and make it more humane towards workers and so forth. And I think that's really important. And it's great that that has happened, and I hope it continues to happen. But there was very little discussion about why a building would collapse spontaneously. Buildings should not be doing this, right? There was no wind that day. There was no earthquake. There was nothing. It just collapsed. And if you look actually at the building permit, you'll notice that the building was approved to be a 4-story building, and that central part of that building, when it collapsed, was 10 stories tall. And you see even from this picture, there was an addition on this side here, there was an addition made here, and they were still planning on adding more stories to this building with all the rebar was left standing, and we see this everywhere in the world, right? So when Kerry says that the next big earthquake in that region, the death toll will be counted in millions, that is absolutely true, and it is terrifying. So I wanted to look at dynamic risk model. So at Stanford and Berkeley developed this kind of performance-based earthquake engineering methodology, which tied the hazard model to the exposure, vulnerability, and all the way to kind of a quantified loss. What was important about that framework is that it was quantitative. All this was put together in one single equation. But I wanted to make that dynamic. So not only being able to tell us what our risk is today, but trying to predict what our risk will be in the future. And I'll use this case study of Kathmandu Valley to demonstrate some of this work. This is what Kathmandu looks like, and this study, by the way, was done before the 2015 earthquake. The global community was already very concerned about Kathmandu as one of the most vulnerable cities in the world to earthquakes, so that's why I had focused on that. And the World Bank at the time was planning a multi-billion-dollar investments in risk reduction in the valley. And so I was working with them to see if our work could inform those investments. So I developed kind of a catalog of common building expansion states, such as this. Develop kind of these structural analysis models that kind of are used to define the vulnerability of these buildings. And this is what I mean by incremental vulnerability and incremental construction, right? And these pictures are not that extreme. We see these buildings everywhere in a city like Kathmandu, and they're very scary buildings. Develop a kind of a stochastic model to simulate the change from one state to the next. And I bundled that in with a kind of simplified cellular automata model of urban growth to combine both kind of the incremental expansion of buildings as well as process of new buildings being built. And in the end, I was able to simulate how the earthquake risk of Kathmandu will change in time. I was using a scenario analysis here because they've been historically very effective for communication, and looking at the 1934 Bihar earthquake as the main example because this, once again, was before this big earthquake. So up until 2015, the 1934 earthquake was the the last big earthquake to have affected that area. So this is the same graphic shown differently. And so you can see, not only is risk increasing, the uncertainty in that risk is increasing as well, because our models, obviously, as you project this in time, get more and more uncertain. But the reason why I show this, and the reason why I think dynamic risk modeling tools are powerful, is that up until today, this is just predicted. It's not predetermined. Famous Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu said, if you do not change direction, you may end up where you are heading. And I think right now, with these models, we can now start seeing where we're heading, right? And now we know we need to change, because otherwise that's where we'll be. So what if all new construction in Kathmandu is designed to higher standards? Or what if our enforcement mechanisms are better? We can start testing out these policies and looking at their impact on future risk. And that's been a very powerful tool with my discussions with people in Kathmandu and officials there, because there had already been a lot of attention on Kathmandu. Every institution concerned with disaster risk had developed for Kathmandu a risk analysis. There is virtually nothing that Kathmandu can do about its existing risk. It took San Francisco 25 years to put in place a policy to address its most vulnerable buildings, and LA is starting now to do the same. And that, in the case of San Francisco, it's just a couple, I think 3,000 buildings, and these are the buildings that will kill people during the earthquake. These are the soft story buildings, incredibly dangerous. And San Francisco is one of the richest cities in the world. Kathmandu has 100,000 buildings and needs to retrofit or more. It just cannot afford to do that, or it needs to displace people to safer sites, which is also infeasible. The best it can do is address critical infrastructure and schools, hospitals, and it is doing so, actually, which is great and very commendable. What they are empowered to do is choose a better risk trajectory moving forward. That is something they can do today. And they can start testing out different policies and looking at the future impact of those policies. So I think these tools are, in that sense, quite empowering, and they've been used. This specific plot, for instance, has been used as an advocacy tool by the World Bank, even in Japan. So I think these are useful, even in very different contexts than Nepal. The second thing I wanted to mention is what we can do to better measure the true benefits of investing in resilience, right? So going back to Singapore and the water, which I hope is blue. That was the intent. So if we want to make the case for Singapore to invest in building its resilience, which I know it is, and that's more so than virtually any other city, which is amazing. So green is my abstract representation of resilience investments. So the way that that's currently done today to make the case for this investments is kind of through actuarial and risk modeling terms. So, and this is what it looks like. This is kind of the fundamental of risk modeling, right? So you develop these curves, these expected probability of loss curves, which basically say, if Singapore does nothing and there is sea level rise, then because of increased flooding, we can expect this level of loss. And we can do that for every frequency of flood events possible. So you can see loss increases with kind of the reduced frequency of hazards. So as the hazards get higher and more frequent, loss increases. If Singapore invests in resilience, that curve shifts to the left, right? So for the same events, the loss is reduced. And that blue is avoided losses, probabilistically, which is really great. And I think that's a very useful tool, and it should be good enough to convince cities to invest in resilience, I believe. And I think in the case of Singapore, that is surely the case. But I think there are other things that we are currently not measuring, right? So Peter Ho mentioned yesterday this idea of dividend of resilience, which Judith Rodin from the Rockefeller Foundation mentioned. And I believe when she talked about it, she meant that if we build our resilience to significant events, then we are also building our resilience. In that process, we're also building our resilience to minor events, to everyday events, right? And that's true, and that's very important. But I'm talking about something different here moving forward. And that is that a city that invests in resilience, and a city that takes pride in that investment, that takes pride in being resilient, will attract more investments. A company is more likely to set up headquarters in Singapore if they know that Singapore will be sustainable in case of climate change, right? And that's true at the urban scale, but that's true at every scale. The household in Bangladesh that feels safe about its home, if the household knows that its home will not be flooded, will invest more in the home, will make it even stronger, even better. And more than that, they can invest in the education of their kids. They can take risks, entrepreneurial risks, right? Because they feel secure in their resilience, right? And that's a benefit even if there is no disaster. That's a benefit just because they feel safer because of that investment in resilience. So this is true at all scales, both at the city scale and the household scale. And the third dividend that we're not measuring are all the co-benefits. That oftentimes these investments, infrastructural investments or natural ecosystem investments, bring other benefits than just reducing disasters, right? A retaining pond, for instance, may serve to control flooding every 5 years or 10 years or so forth. But every day it could be used at a park if it's designed as such. But currently we're not even measuring those co-benefits. And if we're not measuring them, we're not designing for them either. So, can we imagine that the huge billions of dollars of investment that Japan is making on this seawall, right? Can it also be an amazing public infrastructure? I'm not saying I know how to design that. I actually have no idea how to design that. But I think, if you put enough smart people in the room, you could find ways to make sure that when we invest in resilience, we're also trying to maximize these co-benefits that we'll have even in non-disaster situations, right? So this avoided losses, that's a benefit that we'll feel only when something bad happens. And that's a hard sell. That's like saying, if I invest this money now, then when something really bad happens 10 years from now, I'll feel happy knowing that it could have been much worse if I hadn't done so, right? But we're still talking about something bad happening. And particularly, I think, for politicians, that's a very hard sell. If the mayor of San Francisco invests in a huge retrofit program for the buildings, as is going on, by the way, when the big earthquake happens, some people will still die. We will not be celebrating the investment. No one will say 10,000 people could have died and only 500 people did. No one will say that. That will not be in the newspapers, right? So that is hard to sell, right, to politicians. It's important, and I think we need to keep doing that. But I think we also really need to think about the everyday benefits from these investments. And I'm thinking about this. I'm not thinking about this alone. The World Bank has been thinking a lot about this, and so I've been working with them and GFDRR, and they just recently published, actually I think it came out this week, this report, the Triple Dividends of Resilience, and they've published kind of a couple other reports in the past year and a half on this topic. Thirdly, I want to talk about resilient recovery, and a lot of that emerges from my interest and my experience in post-disaster reconstruction settings, and in particular in Port-au-Prince. 2010, the earthquake there is called the Port-au-Prince earthquake. It is not the Port-au-Prince earthquake. It happened in Léogâne, which is the city to the southwest of Port-au-Prince. And it was one of the deadliest earthquakes in history. It killed, the numbers are really uncertain, but from 100,000 to 300,000 people. Absolutely horrific event, right? But the Port-au-Prince earthquake is still expected. The Léogâne earthquake happened on a previously unknown fault. The fault that they thought would be the one causing Port-au-Prince a problem is still probably going to cause Port-au-Prince a problem. And if you look at the historical record, the last time there was a big earthquake in this region, it was actually 2 earthquakes about 25 years apart. And we heard from Carrie yesterday that earthquakes often cluster. I'm afraid that this might also be a cluster, and that the Port-au-Prince earthquake could still very well happen and happen quite soon. And the models that I've developed on this predict that the number of buildings to collapse completely are double what happened in 2010 from the Port-au-Prince earthquake, right? So I'm very concerned about making sure that Port-au-Prince, as it reconstructs the city, does so in a way that's more resilient. So I've been thinking a lot about this, and I was trying to map out a lot of these concepts from the humanitarian community of response, of early recovery, of reconstruction, and of building back better. So these are common terms that they used, and they're linked to specific activities, and I wanted to map them to what that would mean in terms of risk or resilience. Can we actually set targets for these? And even more, building back better, which is kind of the standard, like the golden standard now in risk management or post-disaster management. And that was kind of pretty much the motto for the Sendai conference in Japan. Is in many ways, in my opinion, not enough. It's an incredibly infrastructural focus of building back. So I was thinking of this idea of reformative recovery, set in contrast to restorative recovery. And in this reformative recovery, the idea is really to try to address the systemic processes that create extreme vulnerability. And that goes beyond just better building standards. That is asking questions about how people access land, how people, political disempowerment of a large population of people and so forth, all these questions. And I think we need to be discussing these things. And obviously all this is just a diagram and it's abstract, but at the Urban Resilience Initiative, one of our main short-term goals is to put a qualitative framework on these abstract concepts of resilience. That everyone is recognizing that this term of resilience is becoming very quickly overused and losing its meaning. So at least within our community, we want to be able to define how we will use it. And not only how we'll use it, but how we'll measure it. So we're, developing models that look at adaptive resilience, restorative resilience, absorptive resilience, and seeing how we would go about measuring and modeling these things. Developing kind of the basic science that could support policy later on. And finally, once again, I was so happy to be presenting after Carrie because I think, a lot of these concepts were mentioned already, but the importance to use disaster events to catalyze transformative change. And this is somewhat linked to what I mentioned earlier about transformative recovery, but I was thinking more here at a scale beyond that of the disaster-impacted area. Obviously, Port-au-Prince itself and Haiti needs to learn from that disaster, but I think the world needs to learn from that disaster. And there's precedent for this. In 1755, there was a large earthquake off the coast of Lisbon in Portugal. I was not involved in this recovery. And it was a very large earthquake. Many buildings were destroyed from the shaking, then a tsunami washed away many other buildings, and then a fire burnt the rest. Cataclysmic for Lisbon. And it occurred at a time, kind of smack in the middle of Enlightenment, the Enlightenment period, where there were huge debates about reason and religion and rationality. And one of the leading figures in that debate, Voltaire, if not the leading kind of thinker of the Enlightenment, wrote an amazingly beautiful and powerful poem about the Lisbon earthquake. He was really shocked by the earthquake and shocked by the reaction, the global reaction to the earthquake. And specifically, he attacked this philosophy that was very prevalent at the time of optimism. I'm sorry, I said we should be optimism. This is a slightly different version of optimism, which basically said that in a world created by a perfect God, the world must be as it should be. Everything that happens for a good reason. And and that led to people not trying to explain the disaster event by blaming the people of Lisbon, right? And so he wrote this poem, which is incredibly powerful. So just one passage. It's quite a long poem, but this passage: "What crime, what sin has those young hearts conceived that lie bleeding and torn on mother's breast? Did fallen Lisbon deeper drink of vice than London, Paris, or sunlit Madrid? In these men dance, at Lisbon yawns the abyss." Very powerful poem, and this event really kind of spurred a huge debate among intellectuals of Western Europe. Rousseau, another kind of big philosopher of the time, was very involved in this, and in the end, Voltaire won the debate through the publication of Candide. I highly, highly recommend this. It's a very short book, absolutely beautiful book, in which the Lisbon earthquake plays a very prominent role. It sold 30,000 copies, which at the time, I mean, that was a huge, huge bestseller. It was the Harry Potter of the time. And in many ways, it shaped Western thought. The way that we thought after that was different than the way we thought before. Disaster events can catalyze that at a global scale, right? And another thing that happened, which I find very interesting, is that some scholars have argued that the Lisbon earthquake in many ways created the modern state. And that's because it was the first time in history where the nation of Portugal, understanding that the economic impact of losing Lisbon was so big, took responsibility for the reconstruction. And that had never been done before. Basically, taxpayers from across the nation invested in the reconstruction of Lisbon. That seems, any other way, any other thing would be unthinkable today. But that was the first time this had happened, or one of the first. So I think these are at least two ways that the Lisbon earthquake influenced the world. I also can't mention Voltaire at a conference such as this one without mentioning this other quote: "Uncertainty is an uncomfortable position, but certainty is an absurd one." A brilliant, brilliant thinker, and I think a lot of his writings and sayings are as relevant today as they have ever been. And finally, I want to leave you with this thought. Is that up till now we've been talking about resilience in purely positive ways, and that's because when we talk about resilience, it's resilience to a shock that is a negative shock, right? Resilience to earthquakes, resilience to... But we could also flip this on its head, right? We could think about our current state as our state of vulnerability, and we actually want to go to a lower state of vulnerability. And the processes that create vulnerability, that perpetuate vulnerability, are themselves incredibly resilient. And that's a fundamentally different way that we can think about addressing these problems. It's kind of like if a child suffers from malnutrition, we could either see building their resilience and malnutrition by developing science for kind of these peanut pastes and rehydration salts, and all that is really, really important. But the flip side is we could see what are the processes that are creating and perpetuating malnutrition, and those are systemic issues and structural issues. And ultimately, those are the ones that we need to be addressing. And I think that is true, and I think there is a space in our world as scientists and engineers to be talking about issues of equality and morality and ethics much more so than we currently do. So I hope that even if you don't think the glass is half full, maybe it's a bit more full than it was at lunchtime. I have worked with some fascinating people and with the support of some really interesting organizations that I wanted to recognize here. And mostly I wanted to thank the audience and thank NTU and the Institute Paralimas for this invitation.
Thank you, Debbie, for a very interesting and thought-provoking talk. And I hope that will also provoke questions and discussion amongst the audience. So who's going to fire first?
Thank you. It was a very interesting talk with lots of case study examples. You brought in Haiti, Lisbon, Bangladesh, Singapore. Now, I just want to say that where Singapore is concerned, you said that Singapore's been doing a very good job. We've got a lot of money and interest to do research on this area. And that's also good for investments and also potential migrants to come. Because if they know that this is a safe place, they like to live here, become citizens, and also invest their money. And this is in contrast to, say, a country like Bangladesh. Okay, point well taken. But this is a very micro view, I feel, because even if we take care of ourselves very well, we still have the effects of tidal waves from Aceh. We still have a possible volcano eruption in Sumatra. We still have the haze that comes periodically, okay? And we have also political unrest across the causeway, both ends, and so forth. So, in other words, it has to be global. Now, of course, Singapore is a small place, but even in the United States, okay, there are spillovers, okay? For example, Brexit spill over to, say, Trumpism, for instance. We have, even in big countries like United States, there are spillovers, nuclear, Chernobyl. You can have spyware that goes across boundaries. Climate change, of course, ice melting somewhere, and so forth. So my point is this, that we need to organize disaster management on a global scale. I'm very surprised that even in the talk before yours, and your talk as well, that, we don't mention things like, this is not just a case study countries, isolated studies, either longitudinally or horizontally. It really has to be global. We are one planet. We are one country. And I think that the cup will remain half empty as long as we don't organize our efforts globally, as long as we don't address this question. We cannot solve this problem as long as we remain divided politically. Thank you.
I absolutely agree. I think we do need global approaches and collaborations. One of my main interest and excitement about joining the Earth Observatory of Singapore is specifically because it has that ambition to be a leader in developing the science and capacity regionally, if not beyond even the region. And I think more of these initiatives are needed, and they're critically important. And then, I also mentioned this Lisbon case, where I think was an example of where the world did learn from what happened in Lisbon. And I think, maybe Hurricane Katrina could have been that, and was that in some ways. I think it did fundamentally change the way that the U.S. thinks about disasters and about inequality and race. I wish it had even more impact, but I think that's why it's so important to learn from these disasters and learn much beyond our national borders, because we do live in one world.
Yesterday, we had this wonderful conversation about resilience and how one of the definitions that is emerging is that for a system to be resilient, it doesn't need to return to the state it was in before it went down, but to a functional state that works and hopefully is better. It's a little bit about like the build better. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yes. I'll actually quickly go back there. Yeah, and that's exactly kind of on the quantitative model that we're trying to develop, right? So the F on the y-axis is functionality. And so we're thinking about that at all scales. So that could be applied at the building level to try to understand the different services that a building or a factory has or whatever can be described in terms of functionality, which gets reduced in a disaster, and then there's a process for it to get back to that functionality, and as you see, the curve goes higher. And this is still kind of somewhat of an abstraction of these ideas because, I mean, it really depends on what systems we're talking about, but really this idea that that we don't have to go back to what it was, that we can, even if it's called restorative here, that we probably need to rethink what the use of that word, which has a lot of connotations of back to former, and instead I was using reformative before, and I'm still not sure if that's the correct term, but I think it's important that we find kind of the right language to really make that case that if we learned from these disasters, then by definition we cannot be going back to the previous state.
David, I like the diagrams that you drew. Can we look at the one that came after that? Sorry. Yes. I'm just wondering, in terms of the new stable state, it seems to be lower than the stable state. But at the same time, if there's restorative resilience, would it eventually lead to a higher, instead of a lower dip, will it be a higher dip, as in like we progress upwards?
Yeah, so I think we might have reached the limit of the diagrammability of some of these concepts, because I agree with you that if we think about kind of these ideas of reformative recovery, that would mean that we're not necessarily transitioning to a tipping point where we're kind of going up a hill, going back down, but suddenly the hill has been filled in, so it's at a higher level or something like that, right?
Yeah, yes. So, and I mean, the ecological concept of resilience, I mean, it can also be applied to, say, for example, if there is when there is a terrorist attack on Singapore, and if Singapore recovers well, I mean, the following steps can actually optimistically result in a transformative change. Mm-hmm. Of course, it could also be otherwise. It could be destructive. So I like the way you articulated it and applied it this way. And this form of resilience can be applicable to social transformation. And thank you.
No, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. The cities is not just buildings, but obviously the citizens of the cities, right? So can you please tell us a bit on how you think the collaboration with the citizens and just explaining them your theory and different models that you use, different data that you use, can change actually on how the cities grow, and maybe some of the case studies that are already there in action. Thank you.
Yeah. So I obviously I have an engineering background, so a lot of this is kind of biased towards buildings and infrastructure, but I've actually been kind of working really hard to try to be able to kind of translate around boundaries with the social scientists more. But so I think part of your question about how these models can be used to inform the way that cities grow, I think these models of dynamic risk could be able to show you, for instance, that if a city encourages development in a particular part of the city, we can see what that impact will be in the long term for risk. Right? So it can guide decisions, those type of decisions on how cities grow. I think that, and I didn't really get to talk about this very much, but I think the performance-based earthquake engineering model that I showed earlier was a powerful one because it enabled the seismology community and the engineering community to communicate based on a similar model, and the data was kind of transferable through that model from one community to the other. And I think that's something that we've really struggled to do with a lot more of the social sciences. And I think a lot of my interest is to try to create those type of models that enable us to make that translation and to have communities be able to talk a much more similar language and bring in kind of the human element to it much more strongly. So part of the work, for instance, that I've been doing is looking at, rather than measuring asset losses, trying to measure welfare losses. So looking at, not the absolute value of buildings lost, but what that loss actually means for people. Obviously, $100 loss means very different to two different people, to two different households. And I think those are hopefully kind of useful ways in which we can start to shed light on some of the dynamics of the inequality of risk and other things which traditionally have been the focus of a lot of the social scientists, and much less so in the engineering and risk modeling field, in many ways because our models don't allow us to even notice those things. So hopefully we're moving in that direction.
David, I'm duty-bound, obligated to, indicate to you that not only in Bangladesh, Kathmandu, or any other places, Singapore, you should point it out, in Singapore, Bencoolen Street, Middle Road, the building collapsed, nothing to do with earthquake whatsoever. So you miss, when you spend your time in Singapore, you still don't know that. Now, the other things in regards to your presentation here, there is different element by definition between humanities, social undertaking with that of business undertaking. And your approach is similar, it cannot be similar, because it's not that simple convenient, because you know why? In a commercial undertaking, the risk factor must all be explored. And that's exactly what happened in Bencoolen Street. So the question is that here, please understand that, element of common sense goes beyond just common knowledge. So I hope that you understand that the fundamental in construction and so on is a question of capability. You can't compare first world and third world kind of understanding with that of Haiti and things like that, where, landscape, in terms of earthquake and the others, risk factors is. But if you have a distinction when you talk about investment in Singapore, well, it's entirely a different landscape. Landmines are different, and so is opportunities. Thanks.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. All these different contexts are fundamentally different. I actually think there's probably much more in common than people think. I often use this example, Port-au-Prince in particular. People talk about Port-au-Prince as a completely unique case, and it's not. It's really not unique, and we can expect these events to be much more frequent. And I think, it seems crazy to say, but cities, like San Francisco can learn about what happened in Port-au-Prince, and I think if we really kind of dig deep to see what the lessons learned are, there's a lot that needs to be translated back from developing world to the developed world.
David, I'd like to follow up on your point about the three dividends, because I thought that was a rather interesting way of looking at a situation. And to just go back a moment to the situation that we're in. We now have more than 50% of humankind living in cities. what is disturbing about that is that more than 90% of all the built urban landscape that we now live in has come into being since 1945. This vast landscape. We've in fact been going through by far the largest amount of the worst building in human history with great vigor for about a century. Now, you made the interesting point that if people live in better buildings, they invest in other things. What I want to set you as a challenge, because you seem to like challenges, is we have the notion of micro investment, Grameen Bank type model, which has been helping people to develop at the level of creating businesses. There is an implication in what you said that investment in some fashion into building would have an enormous payoff, just like investment in education does. And that what we should start to look at is how we could invent microfinancing that would actually support improved buildings, even buildings at base that were less likely to fall down in earthquakes and less likely to kill the people who lived inside them. Because if we could reduce that casualty rate, clearly we would make an enormous difference to a society like Haiti. I want to get you to think about that.
Thank you, and I will. I think that's a really interesting idea, and I think I will put the caveat that I wasn't saying that we need to invest necessarily in building safety, but invest in resilience, and that could mean building safety. That could mean other things. But I do think, I presented this more as this is something we need to start measuring, because the truth is that we don't know. We know that households are more willing to invest in a bunch of things if they feel more secure. But that is something that we're not systematically measuring. So I think, there's still a lot of research to be done on that, and I think hopefully that type of research could then inform micro-lending institutions to see possibly that giving loans for better housing and better construction practices is a great investment that could even be monetized, which is not necessarily kind of my goal, but I can see that as a great mechanism for us to achieve our common goals.
Just following on from that, if you are wanting to move to the new, stable, more resilient state and taking almost the disaster as the opportunity, the problem is convincing policymakers and individuals to invest that little bit more to get over the hill. How would you see that, this sort of study, trying to influence that little extra financing that comes in, which is different from microfinancing?
That's
because there's this human tendency, well, if we can just restore things and we just pay for that, that's all we need to pay for.
That's a very difficult question. Partly the issue of political will to already, when you have to do kind of large payouts and large investments after a calamity, it's hard to convince people to give even more. But even on a technical implementation, programmatic level, it is really, really hard. My belief, for instance, which is seems in some ways counterintuitive to what I said, is that if you listen to the rhetoric after the earthquake in Haiti, Bill Clinton was the ambassador to Haiti, and it was explaining how this will be absolutely transformative for Haiti and will set Haiti on a new path to development. And I think in many ways the target was completely unrealistic, and by shooting so high, they weren't able to make it to the minimum standard that they should have been for sure passing. So I think it's a really kind of difficult balance to strike, where or at least in this particular case, where I think the goals were completely unrealistic.
Can I pursue these two earlier questions in the sense of asking you to think slightly beyond what you presented? What do you think the pedagogic lessons are for university training of students? Not only the practical work that comes out of what you learned in Haiti, but also this fascinating conversation. Where should these issues reside in the universities? You talked about engineering and social science, but give us a sense, because you also talked about morality and ethics and these kind of issues. So give us a curriculum, and where should it be?
And that's a really great question, and obviously as someone who has the ambition to be an academic, and I've taught quite a bit, and I love it. And I think these are actually discussions I've been engaged with at Stanford up till now. The School of Engineering just had kind of a rethinking of their 10-year plan, and I was kind of taken aback where kind of the Stanford University, kind of a world-renowned university, when asked what role should the university play for students, the vast majority of answers, what the conclusion was that the university needs to give students the opportunity to pursue anything that they can dream up of. And I thought that was good, but to me that's terribly insufficient. The university also needs to guide students to pursue things that matter, and and at Stanford, a lot of students want to design the new Candy Crush, and that's their aspiration, right? And I think the role of the university is to go much beyond that. So I started teaching, for instance, this quarter a class on disaster risk and international development, and 2 engineers. We haven't looked at any equation. We're just kind of reading this debate between Voltaire and Rousseau on the earthquake in Lisbon, and a lot of kind of literature about the meaning of objects and kind of ethics and morality. And I think that's tremendously important. I think ethics needs to play a much bigger role in our education. And the reality is that there's a demand for that from students. A lot of students are not satisfied with, they aren't necessarily driven by higher salaries. They want to change the world. And some of them do that almost kind of very naively. But I think it's our responsibilities as academics to kind of help them navigate to a place where they can put that energy and that passion to benefiting the world in a way that's not naive, in a way that's not realistic, in a way that's humble. And I'm excited to hopefully get the opportunity to do that in NTU.
Okay, well, just coming back to the Lisbon earthquake, of course, I had the good fortune to go into one of the buildings that did survive, the Academy of Sciences, and maybe that is a hopeful sign.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, on your behalf, I'd like to thank David for his very excellent and thought-provoking presentation.
Thank you.